Case 1. Brittany Marie Adams. Brittany Marie Adams was only 19 years old when a single gunshot on a quiet residential street in Lawrence, Kansas, permanently tied her name to a murder that would echo through courtrooms, prison cells, and one shattered family for years. On the evening of July 17, 2013, the 600 block of Michigan Street looked like any other summer evening in a small American town. Porches lit by warm light, neighbors inside their homes, nothing that hinted at violence. But within minutes, that calm would be replaced by panic, blood, and a dead man lying just outside his own front door. His name was Gary Bell Edens, 51 years old, a father, a grandfather, and a man whose life ended in a moment he never saw coming. The woman who would be held responsible was Brittany Adams, a young woman from Topeka whose path that night led directly into one of the most tragic and disturbing crimes Douglas County had seen in years. The story did not begin in Lawrence. It began in Topeka, where Brittany Adams claimed she had been abandoned by two women who allegedly stole her car, leaving her stranded and angry. Instead of contacting police or family, Adams turned to Jonathan Rush, a convicted felon from Wichita. Rush agreed to drive her, and together they set out toward Lawrence, not with a clear plan, but with weapons in the car and a volatile state of mind. According to later testimony, Adams was armed with two handguns concealed beneath her clothing and told investigators she intended to intimidate the people she believed had information about the women who took her car. Their destination was the home at 647 Michigan Street, where Gary Edens lived with family members. That house had nothing to do with the alleged theft, but Adams believed someone there could lead her to the people she was looking for. When Adams and Rush approached the door, Gary Edens answered. Inside the house were his sons, including Jeremy Edens, who would soon witness the moment that changed his life forever. What started as a knock at the door quickly escalated into a tense encounter. Words were exchanged. Confusion followed. Then a physical struggle broke out between Gary Edens, his son Jeremy, and Jonathan Rush. What happened in the next seconds became the central question of the case. Rush later claimed he never fired his weapon. Adams initially told investigators the gun discharged accidentally during the chaos, but the physical evidence and witness testimony told a darker story. As the men struggled, a gunshot rang out. Gary Edens fell to the ground, shot in the head, mortally wounded, in front of his own home. Jeremy Edens, still grappling with Rush, heard the shot and then saw his father collapse. The moment was sudden, violent, and irreversible. A family was destroyed in seconds. Instead of helping, Adams and Rush ran. They fled the scene in Rush's Pontiac Grand Am, leaving Gary Edens dying on the pavement. During the drive back to Topeka, Adams allegedly threw not one, but two guns out of the car windows along Interstate 70. She also destroyed her cell phone and disposed of it, attempting to erase any trace of what had just happened. These were not the actions of someone in shock. They were the actions of someone trying to erase evidence. Less than an hour after the shooting, authorities stopped the vehicle in Topeka. Adams and Rush were taken into custody. The murder scene in Lawrence was already sealed, and Gary Edens was pronounced dead shortly after being transported to the hospital. The investigation quickly unraveled the version of events Adams first tried to present. Detectives uncovered inconsistencies, witness statements, and physical evidence that contradicted claims of an accident. The most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source, a former jail cellmate. While in custody, Adams allegedly bragged about the killing, telling another inmate that she blew his brains out and describing how she held the gun to the back of his head. The cellmate also testified that Adams claimed she tried to make the shooting look accidental by angling the gun upward, following advice allegedly given by Rush. This testimony transformed the case from a chaotic altercation into something far more intentional and calculated. As evidence mounted, prosecutors escalated the charges from second-degree murder to premeditated first-degree murder. The narrative shifted from accident to intention, from panic to planning. Adams now faced the possibility of life in prison without parole. But the case never reached trial. Instead, a plea deal was reached. On January 17, 2014, Brittany Marie Adams pleaded guilty to intentional second-degree murder. In exchange, the first-degree murder charge was dropped. She also pleaded no contest to 2 felony counts of threatening a corrections officer while in jail. On February 28, 2014, the courtroom became a place of grief and anger. Jeremy Edens stood in front of the woman who killed his father and spoke directly to her. He talked about his younger brother, only 6 years old at the time of the shooting, and about grandchildren who would grow up without a grandfather. His words were not theatrical. They were raw, controlled, and devastating. He told Adams that what she did was selfish, that a good man was gone forever, and that only God could judge whether she felt any remorse at all. Adams said nothing. She did not address the court. She did not speak to the family. She remained silent. The judge sentenced Brittany Adams to 155 months in prison, just under 13 years, for second-degree murder, plus additional time for the threats against a corrections officer. She was also required to register as a violent offender for 10 years after her release. For the Edens family, the sentence felt small compared to the loss. A life had been taken. A family had been broken. A child had lost his father. No number of years could balance that scale. Jonathan Rush, the man who drove Adams to the house and fled the scene with her, was later convicted in federal court for unlawful possession of a firearm as a felon and sentenced to 40 months in prison. His role in the killing remained legally separate but morally inseparable from the events of that night. 2 lives, Adams and Rush, were permanently defined by a decision made in minutes. The murder of Gary Edens was the first homicide in Lawrence in 5 years. It shocked the community not because of its complexity, but because of its randomness. A man answered his door. A confrontation began. A young woman pulled a trigger, and a family was left to live with the consequences forever. This is what makes the Brittany Marie Adams case so disturbing. It is not a story of criminal empires or long-term planning. It is a story of impulsive violence, poor decisions, and uncontrolled anger colliding with firearms and fear. It shows how quickly ordinary life can become irreversible tragedy. 1 drive from Topeka to Lawrence, 1 knock on a door, 1 bullet, 1 dead man, 1 young woman sentenced to spend her youth behind bars. Gary Edens is remembered not as a victim in a headline, but as a father, a grandfather, and a man who never chose this confrontation. Brittany Adams will always be remembered as the woman who walked up to a stranger's home and left a body behind. In true crime, some cases feel distant and complex. This one feels brutally simple. Violence doesn't always come from monsters hiding in shadows. Sometimes it comes from impulsive choices, unstable minds, and moments that spiral out of control. And when it does, the damage lasts for generations. Case 2. James Craig Kaler. James Craig Kaler once looked like a man who had done everything right. He had a steady career, a wife, 3 children, and a reputation as a capable city utilities director. From the outside, his life appeared orderly and respectable, the kind of quiet stability people assume will last forever. But by the fall of 2009, that carefully constructed image had collapsed, leaving behind resentment, obsession, and a sense of humiliation that would end in one of Kansas's most disturbing family massacres. The unraveling began years earlier inside a marriage that was far from calm. Karen Kaler, James's wife, would later describe their relationship as controlling and emotionally exhausting. She claimed that over time, her husband became increasingly domineering, using pressure and intimidation to get what he wanted. By 2008, while the family was living in Texas, Karen formed a relationship with another woman, Sunny Reese. What began as a complicated and unconventional dynamic soon became the breaking point of the Kaler marriage. Karen filed for divorce in early 2009, seeking both legal separation and protection. In court documents, she expressed fear that James's behavior was escalating and that someone could be seriously hurt. Around the same time, James's professional life also began to collapse. His fixation on saving his marriage affected his job performance, and he eventually lost his position. By the time he moved back to Kansas to live with his parents, he had lost his career, his home, and his sense of control. Friends and relatives later testified that James believed his daughters had taken their mother's side. To him, the divorce was not just the end of a marriage, but a personal betrayal carried out by his own family. His world narrowed to a single obsessive idea, that everything he had lost was taken from him deliberately, and that those closest to him were responsible. On November 28, 2009, during the Thanksgiving holiday weekend, Karen traveled with her children to the home of her grandmother, Dorothy White, in Burlingame, Kansas. The house was familiar and safe, a place tied to family memories. James knew they would be there. Sometime that evening, armed with a .223 caliber rifle, he entered the home. What followed unfolded in terrifying silence, one room at a time. Karen Kaler was the first to be shot. Their 10-year-old son, Sean, was standing nearby, helping his mother clean old coins at the kitchen sink when his father walked in and opened fire. Sean later testified that he heard his mother collapse and realized instantly what was happening. He ran, narrowly escaping as his father moved deeper into the house. James did not follow his son. He allowed him to live. Inside the home, the violence continued. 16-year-old Lauren Kaler was shot and severely wounded. 18-year-old Emily Kaler was killed inside the house. Dorothy White, 89 years old, was also shot as she sat in her living room. None of the wounds were immediately fatal. Survivors would later describe the horrifying awareness the victims had in their final moments, knowing who was shooting them and why. But emergency calls captured screams for help and desperate pleas as law enforcement rushed to the scene. When deputies arrived, they found blood throughout the house, shell casings on the floor, and victims still alive but fading. Lauren, struggling to breathe, told an officer that her father had shot her. Dorothy White made the same identification before being rushed to the hospital. James Craig Kaler was already gone. A manhunt followed through the cold Kansas night. James abandoned his red Ford Explorer near a county line and disappeared into the surrounding area. Inside the vehicle, officers later found ammunition, rifle magazines, supplies, and cash, suggesting he may have planned to flee or hide. For more than 7 hours, deputies searched fields and ditches, unsure whether he intended to surrender or die. The next morning, a passerby flagged down a sheriff's deputy and pointed toward a man walking along a ditch. When the deputy approached, the man did not resist. "I'm the guy you're looking for," he said calmly. James was armed but compliant. He appeared tired, cold, and detached, as if the worst part was already over. At trial, the facts of the case were largely uncontested. The defense did not deny that James had carried out the shootings. Instead, they argued that he was mentally ill, broken by divorce, humiliation, and emotional collapse. Prosecutors painted a different picture, a man who planned his actions, armed himself, and methodically killed 4 people he believed stood in the way of his control. The jury heard devastating testimony, including recordings of Lauren Kaler begging for help and the voice of a dying teenager telling officers she did not want to die. Sean Kaler's testimony was among the most powerful. Speaking softly, he described watching his father shoot his mother and realizing he had to run to survive. 2 handwritten notes from Sean were later read to jurors, pleading for his father's life so that he would not lose his entire family. After deliberating, the jury convicted James Craig Kaler of capital murder and multiple counts of first-degree murder. During the penalty phase, jurors weighed aggravating factors against mitigating ones, including James's lack of prior criminal history and claims of severe mental illness. Ultimately, they recommended the death penalty. On October 11, 2011, James was formally sentenced to death. As victim impact statements were read, family members spoke of a loss that could never be repaired, of 3 generations erased in a single night. James showed little emotion. At times, he made sarcastic remarks under his breath, comments that stunned those in the courtroom. Even as the sentence was imposed, he appeared detached from the magnitude of what he had done. The Kaler case remains one of the most haunting examples of domestic violence escalating into mass murder. It is a story not only of rage and control, but of how entitlement, obsession, and resentment can twist personal loss into something deadly. 4 lives ended in a place meant to be safe, and 1 child was left to carry memories no child should ever have. James Craig Kaler did not just destroy his family, and he turned a private collapse into public tragedy, leaving behind a case that continues to raise painful questions about warning signs, accountability, and the thin line between emotional breakdown and calculated violence. Case 3. Lindsay Nicole Blancett. On a quiet December night in Wellington, Kansas, a small town where neighbors recognized each other's cars and children rode bikes down familiar streets, a 911 call shattered the illusion of safety. The woman on the line sounded calm and broken at the same time. She spelled her name clearly. She said words that would haunt everyone who heard them. "I just stabbed my son," she told the dispatcher, adding moments later, "I thought I was saving him from the pain that was coming." That call, placed just before midnight on December 14, 2014, marked the beginning of one of the most disturbing cases the community had ever faced: the killing of 10-year-old Caleb Blancett by his own mother, Lindsay Nicole Blancett. Lindsay Blancett was 33 years old, recently divorced, unemployed, and struggling to keep her life together. On paper, she looked like many overwhelmed single parents: limited income, mounting bills, and the daily pressure of raising 2 children largely on her own. She lived with Caleb and his 9-year-old sister in a modest home in Wellington. Friends and neighbors later described her as quiet, stressed, but not violent. There were no obvious warning signs that would suggest what was coming, and that absence of clarity would later fuel the debate over whether this crime was driven by evil intent or a mind coming apart. In the days leading up to the murder, Lindsay's mental state appeared to deteriorate rapidly. According to testimony and police records, she had become increasingly paranoid. She believed people were coming to harm her children. She fixated on the idea that Caleb had already suffered, or would soon suffer in ways she could not stop. Mental health experts later testified that she was experiencing delusions, possibly triggered by extreme stress and untreated mental illness. Lindsay herself would say that she believed the world was cruel and that her son was too innocent to survive what lay ahead. Shortly before midnight, Lindsay entered Caleb's bedroom while he was sleeping. She carried a knife and an 11-pound rock. Prosecutors would later argue that this alone demonstrated premeditation, not a sudden snap, but a decision made and carried out. She struck Caleb on the head with the rock, fracturing his skull. The blow was not immediately fatal. Caleb woke up. According to Lindsay's own statements, he looked at her and said, "Mom, stop." It is one of the most chilling details of the case because it shows that for at least a moment, Caleb was aware that the person hurting him was the person he trusted most. After the rock failed to kill him, Lindsay stabbed her son multiple times while he lay in his bed. The autopsy later revealed 7 stab wounds to his chest. Prosecutors emphasized that each stab required force, control, and intent. This was not a single impulsive act, they argued, but a sequence of decisions. When it was over, Caleb was dead in the place where children are supposed to be safest. Lindsay then called 911, calmly stating that she knew she would never get out of jail. When police arrived at the scene, they found Lindsay inside the house, her hands and socks soaked in blood. Officers noted that she appeared detached, almost dazed. Her daughter was also in the home but was physically unharmed. Lindsay did not resist arrest. She repeated to officers that she believed she had saved her son from a lifetime of suffering. To her, death was not an act of cruelty, but an act of mercy. From the beginning, the case raised a difficult question. Was Lindsay Blansett a calculating murderer, or was she a severely mentally ill woman who lost touch with reality? That question would dominate the courtroom for nearly a year. Mental health professionals examined her extensively. Some diagnosed her with bipolar disorder, anxiety, and temporary psychosis. Others described her condition as a brief psychotic episode. All agreed on one point. Something was very wrong with her mental state at the time of the killing. Despite these diagnoses, prosecutors insisted that Lindsay knew exactly what she was doing. They pointed to her actions before and after the murder. She chose weapons. She had a backup plan when the first blow did not work. She called 911 and acknowledged that she would go to prison. To the state, these were signs of awareness, not confusion. Mental illness, they argued, did not erase responsibility. The trial in October 2015 was emotionally exhausting for everyone involved. Jurors listened to the 911 call. They saw graphic photographs of Caleb's injuries. They watched police interview videos in which Lindsay alternated between remorse, confusion, and chilling clarity. She admitted what she had done. She explained why she believed she had done the right thing. She never denied killing her son. The defense did not attempt to claim innocence. Instead, Lindsay's attorney focused on her mental condition. Witnesses testified that she had been paranoid, fearful, and disconnected from reality in the weeks before the murder. A note she wrote 2 days before the killing, asking others to love her children and not let them forget her, was presented as evidence that she was unraveling. The defense argued that she was not capable of forming true premeditation because her mind was consumed by delusions. After more than 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Lindsay Nicole Blansett was found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder, as well as aggravated battery. The jurors concluded that even if she was mentally ill, she still acted intentionally. It was a decisive rejection of the insanity defense, and it ensured that Lindsay would spend the rest of her life in prison. At sentencing in December 2015, the court faced another difficult decision. Prosecutors sought a hard 50 sentence, which would require Lindsay to serve at least 50 years before becoming eligible for parole. The judge ultimately chose a lesser sentence of 25 years to life. He cited her lack of criminal history, her documented mental illness, and her acceptance of responsibility as mitigating factors. It was a sentence that satisfied no one completely. Prosecutors expressed disappointment. Others felt even life in prison could not adequately address the tragedy. Today, Lindsay Blansett remains incarcerated in the Kansas Department of Corrections. Caleb is remembered not for the way he died, but for the life he never had the chance to live. The case continues to haunt those who followed it because it exists at the intersection of crime and mental illness, where clear answers are rare and moral certainty is hard to find. It forces an uncomfortable reflection on how society recognizes, treats, and sometimes fails people in psychological crisis. In the end, one truth remains undeniable. A child is gone, a family is shattered, and a community will forever remember the night when a mother believed that killing her son was an act of love. Case 4. Francis Donald Nemechek. Francis Donald Nemechek was not the kind of man people remembered. In western Kansas during the mid-1970s, he blended easily into the background. A young man who worked, hunted, drank beer, and drove long, empty highways without drawing attention. But beneath that ordinary surface was a pattern of rage, humiliation, and sexual violence that would leave 5 people dead, including a small child, and would scar an entire region for decades. His crimes were not impulsive accidents. They were deliberate, escalating acts that unfolded across lonely roads, abandoned farmhouses, and isolated stretches of prairie where screams had nowhere to go. The story begins on the night of December 13, 1974. Interstate 70 cut through western Kansas like a dark ribbon, nearly empty in the winter cold. Perched above the highway near Ogalla, Nemechek waited with a rifle. As a small car passed beneath the overpass, he fired, puncturing one of its tires. The car pulled over, disabled. Inside were Cheryl Young, 21 years old, her friend Diane Levette, 19, and Cheryl's 3-year-old son, Guy. They had been traveling from Colorado back toward Iowa, unaware that a stranger had chosen them at random. What happened next would later be pieced together through confession, forensic evidence, and the grim discoveries made weeks later. Nemechek approached the stranded vehicle. Accounts differ on whether the women initially refused help, but what is certain is that he returned with a shotgun and forced them into his pickup at gunpoint. One of the women carried the child, wrapped in a blanket. As they were driven away from the highway and into deeper isolation. Nemechek took them to an abandoned stone farmhouse he knew well, a structure that had stood empty since the 1930s, on land where he had once worked. Inside that decaying building, he ordered the women upstairs. He later admitted to raping Diane Levette. When Cheryl Young resisted, kicking him in anger and fear, his response was swift and final. He retrieved his shotgun and shot both women. When one continued to curse him after being wounded, he reloaded and fired again. Throughout the entire ordeal, Nemechek claimed he barely noticed the child. Guy Young was left alone in the freezing darkness. At some point, the toddler wandered outside, wearing only light clothing. He froze to death near the farmhouse. His small body later found by trappers more than a month after the murders. The discovery horrified investigators. The women's remains showed signs of prolonged exposure and scavenging by animals, underscoring how long they had lain undiscovered. Yet despite the brutality, the case went cold. Abandoned cars along E70 were common, and nothing immediately connected the disappearance to a known suspect. For over a year, Nemechek walked free. Then, shortly after midnight on January 1, 1976, a Denver family traveling east on Sharon 70 became the target of another sniper attack near the same overpass. Shots struck their vehicle, narrowly missing the occupants. This time, witnesses gave a detailed description of the pickup truck involved. Nemechek was arrested and charged for the shooting, though he was later released on bond. Investigators could not yet link him definitively to the earlier murders. But the location was too familiar to ignore. In June 1976, Nemechek's violence escalated again. Carla Baker, 20 years old and home from college, went for an evening bike ride near Hayes. According to Nemechek's later confession, he exposed himself to her from his truck. When she insulted him and tried to ride away, he grabbed her and forced her into his vehicle. He drove her to a remote area near Cedar Bluff Reservoir, where he attempted to rape her. When she fought back and kicked him, he retrieved a knife and stabbed her. Her body would not be found until months later, hidden in rugged terrain, leaving her family in agonizing uncertainty. Just weeks after that killing, on August 21, 1976, 16-year-old Paula Fabricius disappeared from Cedar Bluff Reservoir. She was working alone as a rangerette, checking vehicle permits, when Nemechek approached her. He later said something inside him snapped. He pulled her into his truck and drove nearly 30 miles to the Castle Rock area, a stark landscape of cliffs and open sky. There, he raped her. When she warned that her father would come after him, he stabbed her repeatedly, including a fatal wound to the heart. He threw her naked body off a bluff, leaving her broken and exposed. This time, the investigation moved quickly. Fabricius's body was found the next morning, and among the evidence was a CB radio warranty card bearing Nemechek's fingerprint. Witnesses placed his truck at the reservoir that day. When questioned, he admitted to speaking with Paula and purchasing the CB radio. He was arrested, and this arrest cracked the entire case wide open. While in custody, Nemechek confessed not only to Paula's murder, but to the killings of Carla Baker, Cheryl Young, Diane Levette, and indirectly, Guy Young. His confessions were chilling in their detachment. He spoke of being depressed, angry at women who reminded him of his ex-wife, and driven by humiliation when they spoke back to him. At trial, psychiatrists debated his sanity, some arguing he suffered from psychosis, others insisting he knew exactly what he was doing and that he tried to manipulate evaluations to appear insane. In February 1977, after hours of deliberation, the jury found Francis Donald Nemechek guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms. In later interviews, he claimed he had found religion and that the man who committed the murders no longer existed. The parole board disagreed. Repeated requests for release were denied, often following emotional testimony from victims' families and thousands of public petitions. The legacy of Nemechek's crimes is not only the lives he destroyed, but the reminder of how violence can hide in plain sight. His victims were ordinary people caught in moments of vulnerability on quiet roads and isolated places. Western Kansas still remembers him not as a troubled man who changed, but as a predator who chose strangers and left devastation behind, proving that even the most empty stretches of road can hold unimaginable danger. Case 5. Deborah J. Green. Deborah J. Green was not supposed to become a headline. She was supposed to be a success story. A gifted child who taught herself to read before most children learned their alphabet, she grew into a brilliant student, a National Merit Scholar, and eventually a physician trained in emergency medicine, oncology, and internal medicine. On paper, her life looked like the American dream: education, marriage, children, and a respected medical career. But behind the carefully maintained surface, her family life was quietly unraveling, and by the fall of 1995, that collapse would end in fire, poison, and the deaths of 2 children. Deborah Green married fellow physician Michael Farrar in 1979. Their marriage, from the beginning, lacked warmth. Farrar later admitted that neither of them ever spoke about love, but even in the early years. Still, they built a life together and had 3 children: Timothy, Kate, and Kelly. While Farrar advanced steadily in his medical career, Green struggled. Chronic pain, migraines, insomnia, and professional dissatisfaction began to take their toll. By the early 1990s, she had left her practice and become a homemaker, a role that only deepened her sense of resentment and instability. The marriage deteriorated further as Green's emotional volatility intensified. According to Farrar, she was prone to explosive rages, breaking objects, and sometimes harming herself. Arguments became common, and the children were frequently drawn into the conflict, especially Timothy, who developed a hostile relationship with his father. In 1994, Farrar asked for a divorce. Green reacted violently, but the couple attempted reconciliation, hoping a new home might fix what was already broken. Instead, things grew worse. By 1995, Farrar began suffering from sudden severe illness. He experienced repeated bouts of vomiting, diarrhea, dehydration, and fever, requiring multiple hospitalizations. Doctors were baffled. His condition did not fit any clear diagnosis. Each time he returned home and ate meals prepared by Green, the symptoms returned. At the time, Farrar dismissed the possibility of poisoning as unthinkable. Green was a doctor. She was the mother of his children. Meanwhile, Green's behavior became increasingly erratic. She drank heavily while caring for the children, spoke openly about suicide, and expressed violent thoughts toward Farrar's girlfriend, Margaret Hacker. In September 1995, Farrar searched Green's belongings and found castor bean seed packets, potassium chloride vials, and a draft of an anonymous letter meant to pressure him into abandoning the divorce. When confronted, Green alternated between denial and claims she intended to kill herself. Police were called, and Green was briefly hospitalized and diagnosed with bipolar depression. She was prescribed multiple psychiatric medications and released. Farrar moved out immediately. Less than a month later, disaster struck. Just after midnight on October 24, 1995, the Farrar family home in Prairie Village, Kansas, erupted in flames. Deborah Green and her 10-year-old daughter, Kate, escaped. 13-year-old Timothy and 6-year-old Kelly did not. Firefighters arrived quickly, but the blaze was already out of control. The children were trapped inside. Both died of smoke inhalation. From the beginning, investigators were unsettled by Green's demeanor. She was calm, almost cheerful. She referred to her children in the past tense and by their ages rather than their names. She told police that her son Timothy had contacted her over the intercom during the fire, asking what to do, and that she instructed him to stay inside and wait for rescue. Fire investigators later said that advice was fatal. The fire itself raised immediate red flags. It burned with unusual speed and intensity. Investigators soon discovered pour patterns consistent with liquid accelerant throughout the house, blocking escape routes and leading back to the master bedroom. Green's hair showed signs of singeing, despite her claim she was never near flames. The fire was ruled arson. As the arson investigation unfolded, detectives revisited Farrar's unexplained illness. Laboratory testing confirmed ricin antibodies in his blood, indicating repeated poisoning. Ricin is derived from castor beans. Store records and witness testimony placed Green purchasing out-of-season castor bean seeds weeks earlier. The pieces began to align into a chilling picture. Green was arrested on November 22, 1995, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and aggravated arson. Prosecutors alleged she poisoned her husband and deliberately set the fire that killed her children. Green maintained her innocence. Her defense argued that Timothy, her deceased son, was responsible for both the poisoning and the fire, citing his alleged fascination with fire. The theory was widely criticized and supported only by questionable testimony. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors prepared to seek the death penalty. Faced with overwhelming forensic evidence and the risk of execution, Green agreed to a plea deal. In April 1996, she entered a no-contest plea, acknowledging that the state had sufficient evidence to convict her. She claimed she had no memory of the fire and insisted she never intended to kill her children. On May 30, 1996, Deborah Green was sentenced to 2 concurrent 40-year prison terms. She would never walk free until at least her 80s. In later years, she continued to shift blame, alternately citing medication, alcohol, her son, and even her husband's girlfriend. Courts rejected her appeals for a new trial. The case of Deborah Green remains one of the most disturbing family annihilation cases in modern American history. It shattered the assumption that education and status protect against unimaginable violence. A physician trained to save lives instead used her knowledge to destroy her own family. 2 children died in their beds, trusting the person meant to protect them. And the fire that consumed their home exposed a truth far darker than anyone ever expected. Case 6. Scott Philip Roeder. On the morning of May 31, 2009, the city of Wichita, Kansas, was quiet in the way only Sunday mornings can be. Church bells rang, doors opened, and congregations gathered for worship. Inside Reformation Lutheran Church, Dr. George Richard Tiller stood in the foyer handing out bulletins, performing the simple duties of an usher. For decades, Tiller had lived under constant threat, yet this moment was ordinary, peaceful, and unguarded. Within seconds, it would become one of the most shocking acts of ideological violence in modern American history. A single gunshot echoed through the church foyer, ending the life of a man whose work had placed him at the center of one of the nation's most divisive moral debates. George Tiller was 67 years old when he was shot point-blank in the head with a .22 caliber handgun. And despite wearing body armor, something he had done for years after repeated threats, the bullet struck him fatally. The shooter raised his weapon at two people who attempted to intervene, then fled the church and disappeared into the morning traffic. Witnesses later described his car as a powder blue Ford Taurus. Tiller's wife, Jane, was inside the sanctuary singing in the choir when the shot rang out. Moments later, her scream carried through the building as the reality set in. Within hours, Scott Philip Roeder was arrested nearly 170 miles away near Kansas City. Born on February 25, 1958, Roeder was not a stranger to extremist beliefs or law enforcement scrutiny. He was charged with first-degree murder and 2 counts of aggravated assault the following days. The arrest came quickly, but the events that led to the killing stretched back decades, woven through anti-government ideology, religious extremism, mental illness, and a growing obsession with one man. Roeder would later confess openly, offering no remorse. In interviews from jail, he claimed he acted to save preborn children and believed the killing was justified. To him, George Tiller was not a doctor, but an enemy, someone he described using dehumanizing language borrowed from extremist rhetoric. This mindset did not form overnight. Friends, family members, and investigators traced it back to the early 1990s, when Roeder began drifting into anti-government movements after financial struggles and personal instability. According to his ex-wife, Lindsay Roeder, Scott struggled to cope with everyday life. Bills went unpaid, employment was inconsistent, and frustration turned into resentment. Someone introduced him to conspiracy theories surrounding federal taxes and government legitimacy. That doorway led him into militia groups, the Sovereign Citizen Movement, and eventually the Montana Freemen. By 1996, his radicalization had already escalated to criminal behavior. He was stopped by police in Kansas while displaying a Sovereign Citizen placard instead of a license plate. Inside his trunk, officers found bomb components, gunpowder, and batteries. Though that conviction was later overturned due to an illegal search, the pattern was clear. Mental health concerns shadowed Roeder throughout his adult life. Court records and family testimony referenced a diagnosis of possible schizophrenia with suggestions of bipolar disorder. He was not consistently medicated. Despite this, he remained free, drifting from job to job and immersing himself further into extremist ideology. His beliefs eventually fused anti-government paranoia with militant anti-abortion rhetoric, forming a worldview where violence became morally acceptable. By the late 1990s, Roeder was openly associating with individuals connected to the Army of God, an underground extremist movement that promotes the killing of abortion providers as justifiable homicide. Former roommates and acquaintances later stated that Roeder spoke obsessively about George Tiller, discussing plans to kill him years before the crime occurred. One acquaintance claimed Roeder entered a clinic, stared silently at a doctor for nearly a minute, and said, "I've seen you now," before leaving. George Tiller had been a target long before Roeder pulled the trigger. His clinic was bombed in 1986. He was shot in both arms in 1993 and survived. Protests followed him everywhere, his workplace, his home, and even his church. Despite this, Tiller continued his work, believing deeply in providing medical care to women facing severe and often tragic circumstances. To supporters, he was compassionate and brave. To extremists, he was a symbol of evil. In the days before the murder, warning signs appeared. Roeder was suspected of vandalizing clinic entrances by gluing locks shut, Reports were made to authorities. Nothing stopped him. On May 31st, he walked into a church, waited for his moment, and carried out the act he believed was his divine duty. The reaction was immediate and global. President Barack Obama condemned the murder, calling it a heinous act of violence that could never resolve moral disagreements. Religious leaders across denominations echoed the sentiment, rejecting violence in all forms. Even major anti-abortion organizations publicly denounced the killing, distancing themselves from Roeder while grappling with the consequences of decades of inflammatory rhetoric. Not all responses were unified. Extremist voices praised the murder, calling Roeder a hero. Some commentators questioned whether the ideological framing of abortion as murder inevitably leads to violence. Others accused media figures of fueling hatred through demonization. The case became more than a homicide. It became a national mirror reflecting the dangers of radicalization. At trial, Roeder took the stand and admitted to the killing, and he described elaborate fantasies of stopping Tiller, from mutilation to staged accidents, before deciding the simplest method was a gunshot in church. His defense attempted to argue voluntary manslaughter, claiming he believed deadly force was necessary. The judge rejected the argument. After less than 40 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. On April 1, 2010, Roeder was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 50 years, the harshest sentence available under Kansas law. During sentencing, he compared himself to Jesus Christ and shouted accusations at prosecutors, reinforcing the court's belief that he posed a continuing danger. George Tiller's family spoke not of politics, but of loss. They described a husband, father, and grandfather whose life had been extinguished by hate. And they insisted his legacy would not be defined by his murderer, but by the countless women he helped. Scott Roeder now sits in prison, aging, unrepentant, and convinced he acted righteously. The murder of George Tiller stands as a stark reminder of how ideology, when stripped of humanity, can transform belief into bloodshed. It was not just an assassination of a man, but an attack on the idea that violence can ever be a moral solution. Case 7. Esme K. Tseng. Esme K. Tseng was 16 years old when her life and the quiet suburban world around her collapsed in a single, irreversible night. She was an honor student, a gifted classical pianist, an athlete, a debater, and the kind of teenager teachers pointed to as an example of promise fulfilled. In Overland Park, Kansas, a place defined by manicured lawns and expectations of safety, Esme was not supposed to become a headline. She was supposed to become a success story. Instead, on August 19, 2005, she stabbed her mother, Shu-Yi Jiang, to death inside their family home, setting off one of the most disturbing juvenile homicide cases the United States had seen in years. To understand how this happened, investigators, journalists, and an entire community were forced to look beyond the crime itself and into the private pressures of a family that outwardly appeared perfect. Esme was the only child of Chinese immigrant parents who believed deeply in discipline, achievement, and sacrifice. From an early age, excellence was not encouraged, it was required. Her piano practice was relentless, her grades scrutinized, her behavior constantly measured against an invisible but unforgiving standard. In her online diaries, written long before the murder, Esme described a home ruled by fear of failure, emotional punishment, and humiliation. She wrote of being grounded for earning a 96% on a test, of being threatened with the sale of her piano if she did not win competitions, and of moments so degrading they blurred the line between discipline and abuse. To outsiders, none of this was visible. Friends described Esme as sweet, intelligent, and composed. Parents said they would trust her to babysit their children. Teachers praised her discipline. But online, behind usernames and late-night posts, a different Esme existed. She wrote about sleeplessness, racing thoughts, anger she could not control, and a growing fear that something inside her was breaking. She questioned whether she had a mental illness and admitted she was terrified to tell anyone, worried her worst fears would be confirmed. Her posts were raw, sometimes profane, sometimes philosophical, often desperate. They read less like teenage melodrama and more like a prolonged cry for help that went unanswered. As she entered high school, the pressure intensified rather than eased. Esme drifted away from childhood friends and toward a new social circle that experimented with drugs and rebellion. She began using ecstasy and mushrooms, substances that temporarily dulled her anxiety but left her deeply depressed afterward. Friends noticed changes. She became obsessive, withdrawn, paranoid at times. She spoke about people reading her thoughts, about memories she could not trust, about wanting to escape her own mind. At one point, she sought refuge at a synagogue, telling a rabbi she heard voices instructing her to act. Police were called, and she was returned home. No formal intervention followed. The relationship between Esme and her mother grew increasingly volatile. Friends later described shouting matches, emotional manipulation, and a household filled with constant tension. Esme's mother, once successful in her career, had lost her job and blamed her daughter for her inability to retire. Notes criticizing Esme were reportedly left around the house, signed and typed, listing her failures. Rather than crying, Esme corrected the grammar and handed them back. It was a chilling detail that suggested emotional numbness rather than resilience. On August 19, 2005, something inside that house finally shattered. What is known from investigators is limited but grim. The confrontation between mother and daughter escalated into violence that moved through several rooms. Shuyi Jiang suffered multiple stab wounds and died at the scene. Esme was arrested the same day and charged with first-degree murder. She was 16 years old. The community reacted with disbelief. This was not a case that fit comfortably into familiar narratives of juvenile crime. Esme was not known for violence. She had no criminal record. She was not failing school or living on the margins. The question that dominated headlines was not simply what happened, but why. Was Esme a cold-blooded killer or a mentally overwhelmed child pushed beyond her limits? Prosecutors moved quickly to have Esme tried as an adult, arguing that the severity of the crime demanded serious punishment. Johnson County District Attorney Paul Morrison described the killing as exceptionally violent and insisted that age could not excuse what he called hacking somebody to death with a knife. Trying Esme as a juvenile, he argued, risked her release after only a few years. An adult conviction would ensure significant prison time. And the decision ignited national debate. Human rights organizations, child psychologists, and community advocates argued that adolescents are neurologically different from adults, lacking full impulse control and emotional regulation. They pointed to Esme's documented mental distress, her age, and her background as evidence that rehabilitation, not adult incarceration, was appropriate. Supporters packed courtrooms, signed petitions, and created websites dedicated to keeping her case in juvenile court. They described her as frightened, fragile, and clearly not a danger to society. In court, Esme appeared small and terrified, shackled at the waist and ankles. Witnesses described her whispering answers, mouthing, "I'm scared" to friends, and pleading not to be taken back to detention. Despite the public support, the legal system moved forward. On March 6, 2006, Esme pleaded guilty in adult court to voluntary manslaughter, avoiding a potential life sentence for first-degree murder. The plea acknowledged responsibility without labeling the act as premeditated murder. On May 3, 2006, she was sentenced to 8 years and 4 months in prison. At 17, she entered the Topeka Correctional Facility for women as its youngest inmate. Those who feared for her safety worried she would be traumatized further by adult incarceration. Prosecutors countered that she was capable of violence and should be treated accordingly. While in custody, Esme reportedly expressed deep remorse and grief. She told friends she missed her mother and felt that people failed to understand she had lost her too. She referred to herself as a murderer and struggled with the idea that she might be viewed as evil forever. Letters interneted between guilt, confusion, and a longing for music, something prison could not provide. Esme Tseng was released on October 1, 2012, after serving the majority of her sentence. By then, the media frenzy had faded, but the questions her case raised had not. Her story remains a haunting example of how extreme pressure, untreated mental illness, cultural conflict, and adolescent vulnerability can converge with catastrophic consequences. This was not a story with a clear villain or an easy moral. A woman lost her life. A teenager lost her childhood. A community lost its sense of certainty. The case of Esme Tseng forces an uncomfortable truth into the spotlight. Sometimes the warning signs are there, written plainly for anyone willing to read them, and sometimes they are ignored until it is too late. Case 8. Mark Vincent Sappington. In the spring of 2001, Kansas City, Kansas was not prepared for the name Mark Vincent Sappington. It would take only a few weeks for this quiet, unremarkable young man to become something far darker, a figure the media would later label the Kansas City Vampire. His crimes were not only brutal, but deeply unsettling, crossing psychological boundaries that most people prefer to believe do not exist. By the time the killing stopped, 4 people were dead, all known to Sappington, and investigators were left trying to understand how schizophrenia, drugs, fear, and choice collided into one of the most disturbing crime sprees in Kansas history. Mark Vincent Sappington was born on February 9, 1978, and raised on the north side of Kansas City, Kansas, an area shaped by poverty, church culture, and in constant police sirens. His father disappeared before Mark was born, leaving his mother to raise him alone. She leaned heavily on religion, bringing Mark to church every Sunday, hoping faith would anchor him in a neighborhood where violence and drugs were never far away. By most accounts, she tried everything she could to keep her son on the right path, and for a time, it seemed to work. Mark was quiet, polite, and oddly charming. Teachers described him as intelligent, though not particularly driven, and friends saw him as soft-spoken and even funny. As Mark entered adolescence, cracks began to show. He developed a habit of using PCP, often smoking cigarettes soaked in embalming fluid, known on the street as danks. The drug is infamous for triggering paranoia, hallucinations, and violent psychosis. Over time, Mark began hearing voices. According to him, they were constant, threatening, and terrifying. They told him that he needed to eat flesh and drink blood, or he would die. He did not describe them as divine or demonic, only as unavoidable commands. He said he was afraid of them. He also said he believed them. The violence began on March 16, 2001. Mark and an acquaintance named Armando Gaitan had obtained an assault rifle and decided to commit a robbery. They had no specific target, only a vague plan to find someone vulnerable. That person turned out to be David Mashak, a 25-year-old auto dealership employee. Mashak did not resist when confronted, but for reasons that remain unclear, Mark opened fire and killed him. It was Mark's first murder, and it shattered any remaining boundary between thought and action. After the shooting, Gaitan fled to Texas, while Mark stayed behind, carrying the weight of what he had done. In the weeks that followed, Mark's mental state deteriorated rapidly. The voices grew louder. He wandered the streets, looking at strangers, silently asking himself, what about him? What about her? According to police, this process lasted nearly 3 weeks. Anyone could have been next. What ultimately made the situation more disturbing was that Mark did not select strangers. He chose people who trusted him. On April 7, 2001, 25-year-old Terry T. Green stopped by Mark's house, something he had done many times before. There was nothing unusual about the visit. At some point, Mark later said, the voices took control. He lured Green into the basement and attacked him with a knife hidden there earlier. The violence was extreme. Blood splattered the walls. When Green was dead, Mark claimed the voices ordered him to drink his blood. He attempted to do so, but stopped when he heard a noise upstairs. Fearing discovery, he wrapped Green's body and drove it across the river into Kansas City, Missouri, leaving it inside a car at a nightclub parking lot. The body was found quickly, but for several days, police did not connect the murder to Mark. 3 days later, on April 10th, Mark killed again. This time, the victim was Michael Weaver, Jr., 22, another acquaintance. Mark encountered Weaver outside his home and suggested they go for a drive. In a dark alley just blocks away, Mark stabbed Weaver to death. Once again, he attempted to drink blood but fled before completing the act. Weaver's body was left behind, undiscovered for hours. By now, Mark had killed 3 people. And on his way home from Weaver's murder, he encountered 16-year-old Alton Fred Brown, Jr., a teenager who admired Mark and viewed him as an older brother. The voices approved. Mark invited Fred back to his house. This time, the murder was different. Mark used a gun. After killing the boy, he dismembered the body in his mother's basement, cooked part of the flesh, and ate it. He later told police he planned to freeze the remaining flesh to eat later. Mark's mother discovered blood leading to the basement hours later. When she saw what had happened, she called police immediately. Officers arrived to find Fred Brown's remains in trash bags. Mark fled briefly, carjacking a woman and leading police on a short chase, before being arrested on April 12, 2001. During interrogation, Mark was initially silent. Then, without prompting, he began to speak. He described the murders in detail. He talked about the voices, the blood, and the flesh. Detectives were stunned. Even veteran investigators struggled to classify what they were hearing. This was not sexual sadism. It was not ritualistic. It was chaotic, driven by fear and mental collapse rather than pleasure. Mark was charged with 4 counts of murder, along with kidnapping, aggravated burglary, and attempted robbery. His lawyers argued that schizophrenia and heavy PCP use had destroyed his grip on reality. Prosecutors acknowledged his severe mental illness and chose not to seek the death penalty. In 2004, Mark was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and later convicted of felony murder in the Mashak case. He received multiple consecutive life sentences, and along with additional prison terms. Today, Mark Vincent Sappington remains incarcerated, serving 4 consecutive life sentences. His case remains one of the most disturbing in Kansas history, not just because of the violence, but because of how ordinary he once seemed. He was not a drifter or a stranger lurking in the dark. He was a friend, a neighbor, a familiar face. The most terrifying truth of the Sappington case is that the danger did not come from the shadows. It came from someone people trusted until it was far too late. Case 9. Diana Lumbrera. Diana Lumbrera's story begins in a way that, for many years, disarmed suspicion rather than provoked it. She was young, fragile-looking, deeply emotional, and outwardly devoted to her children. When she appeared at hospital doors carrying lifeless infants, crying and collapsing in grief, few doctors or nurses imagined that the danger had arrived with the mother herself. For nearly 14 years, death followed Diana Lumbrera wherever she went, quietly and persistently, hidden behind medical terminology, superstition, and a collective reluctance to believe that a mother could be responsible for such devastation. Born on November 21, 1958, in Texas, Diana married at just 17 years old. Her marriage to Lionel Garza was volatile from the start, unmarked by arguments and reconciliations that produced 3 children in rapid succession. In 1975, their daughter Melissa was born. In 1976 came Joanna, and in 1977, their first son, Jose Lionel. Diana appeared to fulfill the role expected of her: young wife, young mother, constantly occupied with infants. What no one realized was that her children's lives were already following a terrifying pattern. Joanna was the first to die. At just 3 months old, she was rushed to a small Texas hospital, already lifeless. Diana told doctors the baby had suffered sudden convulsions and stopped breathing. The explanation sounded tragic, but plausible. A pathologist attributed the death to asphyxiation linked to convulsive disorder, and no autopsy was ordered. The system accepted the story, and Diana left the hospital as a grieving mother, not a suspect. 2 months later, history repeated itself. Jose Lionel was brought to the emergency room after Diana reported convulsions and breathing problems. This time, doctors managed to revive him and transferred him to a pediatric intensive care unit. For several days, the baby was stable. Then, in the early hours of the morning, a nurse noticed Diana standing by the crib. Later that same day, she phoned her husband and ominously told him the baby was dying. Within hours, Jose Lionel was dead. Despite the troubling sequence of events, no one confronted Diana directly. The death was ruled unexplained. In October 1978, Diana arrived at the same emergency room holding 3-year-old Melissa, dead on arrival. Once again, she described sudden convulsions and rapid collapse. A pathologist ruled the cause of death as asphyxia due to aspiration of stomach contents. 3 children gone, all under mysterious circumstances, yet no investigation followed. Doctors searched for medical explanations because the alternative was too disturbing to consider. After divorcing her husband in 1979, Diana continued forming relationships and having children, each with a different partner. Beginning in 1980, she gave birth to 3 more children out of wedlock. None of them survived early childhood. The deaths continued across cities and counties, each one isolated just enough to avoid immediate connections. Even children who were not hers were not entirely safe. In October 1980, Diana volunteered to care for her cousin's 6-week-old baby, Erica Alleman. She went for a short drive and returned to the emergency room less than an hour later with the infant already dead. Once again, Diana described convulsions and sudden respiratory failure. Medical records were incomplete, and no one challenged her account. The pattern deepened, but so did the silence. 2 years later, Diana's daughter Melinda died at home at age 2. Doctors attributed the death to heart failure linked to congenital heart disease. No autopsy followed. 15 months later, Diana gave birth to another son, Christopher Daniel Lambrera. He was treated for a routine ear infection in March 1984 and appeared healthy. 3 days later, he was rushed to the hospital dead. The cause was listed as septicemia, despite earlier tests showing no infection. Again, inconsistencies were dismissed. In 1985, Diana moved to Garden City, Kansas, where she soon became pregnant again. Her final child, Jose Antonio Lambrera, was born in February 1986. Unlike the others, he survived into early childhood, living more than 4 years. To outsiders, his survival seemed to contradict any suspicion. In reality, it delayed the inevitable. In April 1990, Diana took Jose Antonio to a doctor, complaining of mysterious convulsions. No medical cause was found, but antibiotics were prescribed. Diana never filled the prescription. The next day, she carried her son into the emergency room. He was already dead. This time, something was different. Doctors noticed signs inconsistent with natural causes. They called the police. Detective James Hawkins began asking questions no one had asked before. He compiled a list of Diana's children, their dates of birth, and their deaths. The pattern was unmistakable. Every child had died under her sole supervision. Many were insured, sometimes with policies taken out shortly before death. Each medical emergency followed the same script: convulsions, sudden collapse, frantic rush to the hospital, arrival too late for help. Kansas authorities moved first. Diana was charged with murder in the death of Jose Antonio. During trial, experts testified that the child died from deliberate suffocation. The defense attempted to argue infection, but the prosecution exposed critical flaws in that claim. After less than an hour of deliberation, the jury convicted Diana Lumbrera of murder. She was sentenced to life in prison. The Kansas conviction triggered a cascade of investigations in Texas. Grand juries in multiple counties issued murder indictments. Evidence revealed insurance policies ranging from $3,000 to $5,000 on several children. In one case, an additional policy had been purchased just one day before a child's death. Prosecutors argued that Diana had carefully staged medical visits to create a paper trail that would later explain sudden deaths. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Diana entered guilty and no contest pleas in several Texas cases, receiving additional life sentences. In exchange, some charges were dropped to avoid the emotional and financial cost of multiple trials. By June 1991, Diana Lumbrera was returned to Kansas to begin serving her sentence. To this day, some family members insist she was innocent, pointing to her belief in curses and spiritual healers. Diana herself claimed her former mother-in-law had cursed her children, but investigators dismissed superstition as distraction. The evidence told a simpler, darker truth. Over 14 years, and 7 children died in her care. The common factor was not illness, fate, or witchcraft. It was Diana Lumbrera. Her case forced hospitals nationwide to reconsider how sudden infant deaths were evaluated and how patterns were ignored when the suspect did not fit society's image of a killer. Diana Lumbrera did not look like a monster. She looked like a grieving mother. And that, perhaps, was what made her so dangerous. Case 10. Reginald and Jonathan Carr. In the quiet winter nights of Wichita, Kansas, in December 2000, terror arrived not with a storm, but with 2 brothers, Reginald and Jonathan Carr, whose week-long crime spree would shock the nation and leave a trail of unimaginable horror. Known later as the Wichita Massacre, their rampage combined robbery, sexual assault, and cold-blooded murder, forever altering the lives of their victims and the city itself. The Carr brothers, aged 22 and 20, had criminal records long enough to raise warning flags, but no one could have predicted the level of calculated brutality they would unleash over the course of a few terrifying days. The spree began on December 8th, when the brothers, newly arrived in Wichita, forced 23-year-old assistant baseball coach Andrew Schreiber into his car at gunpoint. They demanded money and compelled him to visit multiple ATMs, while one brother followed in a separate vehicle, threatening him with lethal violence if he failed to comply. Schreiber's ordeal ended in a remote field northeast of town, where the brothers pistol-whipped him, shot out his tires, and left him shaken but alive. This act, though horrifying, was only the prelude to what was to come. 3 days later, on December 11th, the Carrs escalated their violence. In a suburban driveway, 55-year-old Ann Walenta, a cellist and librarian, attempted to escape in her SUV. Reginald and Jonathan approached under the guise of seeking help, but quickly turned lethal. Walenta was shot multiple times, leaving her paralyzed from the waist down. Despite surviving initially, she succumbed to her injuries 3 weeks later. Investigators later identified the same handgun used in her shooting at the crime scene of the subsequent massacre. At this point, Wichita was already on edge, though few realized the scale of the horror that would unfold. The defining nightmare of the Carr brothers' spree occurred on December 14th. They chose a house, seemingly at random, where 5 young adults, Jason Befort, Brad Haka, Aaron Sander, Heather Muller, and a woman known only as HG, were spending the night. HG, a 25-year-old schoolteacher, arrived with her pet schnauzer Nikki around 8:30 p.m., finding the house partially empty. Within hours, the Carrs forced their way in, guns drawn, shattering the illusion of safety. What followed was a 3-hour ordeal of terror, sexual assault, and psychological degradation. The brothers forced the victims to strip, bind, and submit to acts of sexual humiliation. Men were coerced into acts with women, women with each other, all while being watched, threatened, and dehumanized. The Carrs' obsession was not only with money. They rifled through ATMs, emptied bank accounts, and stole valuables, but also with asserting complete dominance over their victims, stripping them of dignity and control. H.G.'s testimony painted a picture of calculated sadism. She described a clock counting down the minutes as the men were forced to perform sexual acts, the beatings for refusal, and the relentless psychological torture. Reginald and Jonathan displayed a perverse blend of casual conversation and lethal intent. They spoke to H.G. as though sharing a trivial social moment, commenting on her appearance while simultaneously preparing to kill her friends. They found an engagement ring hidden in a can of popcorn, inadvertently discovering Jason Befort's intention to propose, and used it as a cruel psychological weapon. By the time the victims were forced outside, the temperature hovered around 17.6 degrees Fahrenheit, with snow blanketing the ground. The women were partially clothed, the men fully naked, all marched into the freezing night as if mere playthings. The execution was methodical. Victims were ordered to kneel in the snow while the Carrs shot them in the back of the head, one by one. H.G. survived by playing dead, a feat of nerve and resilience, only to witness the brothers drive a truck over the bodies of her friends. She managed to escape, running more than a mile barefoot in freezing temperatures. Her body covered in bullet wounds, her mind focused on survival and alerting anyone who could help. In her account, the horror was compounded by helplessness. Her boyfriend's life extinguished, her friends murdered, her pet killed, yet she maintained the clarity to navigate through the cold, reach a safe house, and summon assistance. The capture of the Carr brothers was swift. Within 12 hours, law enforcement located Reginald at an apartment with his girlfriend, while Jonathan fled, but was soon apprehended. Evidence, including the Lorson .30 handgun, linked them to Walenta's murder, the home invasion, and the subsequent killings. Their spree had left 5 dead, 1 severely injured, and 1 surviving witness scarred, physically and psychologically. Despite the overwhelming evidence and the horror of the crimes, controversy arose over the nature of prosecution and media coverage. The Sedgwick County District Attorney declined to pursue hate crime charges, citing lack of evidence of racial motivation, as all the victims were white and the perpetrators African American. Critics argued this double standard, noting the muted national attention compared to similar crimes with inverted racial roles. The trial, delayed by legal maneuvering, eventually led to convictions. On November 14, 2002, Reginald and Jonathan Carr were sentenced to death. Reginald received additional sentences totaling decades for other violent offenses, and Jonathan was similarly sentenced. For H.G., the surviving victim, the courtroom offered little closure, and she had endured a week of terror condensed into a single night. During sentencing, her courage resonated in a statement. The Carrs' punishment could never match the pain inflicted on her and her friends. Her composure underlined the profound imbalance between the life-altering impact of the crimes and the finality of justice. The massacre sparked debates on media coverage, race, and societal reaction. Some residents argued that if the racial dynamics were reversed, the story would have dominated national headlines. Others observed the remarkable heroism of H.G., whose survival depended on courage, presence of mind, and sheer luck. The city of Wichita grappled with grief, fear, and a renewed focus on personal security. Local schools and community organizations memorialized the victims, ensuring their legacies endured beyond the cold night when lives were brutally cut short. Looking back, the Wichita Massacre stands as a chilling reminder of random violence and human cruelty. It is also a testament to survival against unimaginable odds. H.G.'s journey from victim to witness was heroic, navigating extreme trauma to bring her attackers to justice. The Carr brothers' spree highlighted gaps in the criminal justice system, the speed at which violence can escalate, and the lasting scars left on survivors and communities. Their actions and the subsequent legal reckoning remain embedded in Kansas history, a dark chapter defined by brutality, resilience, and the stark realities of crime that can strike any city on any winter night.